Hi, my name is Lindsey Leonard, and today I'm going to be talking about bride kidnapping. So, a quick overview of everything I'm going to be going through in this presentation is I'm going to be first going over the history and demographics of bride kidnapping. Then I'll be taking a look at it in Kyrgyzstan and China, and then I'll be taking a look at the cultural similarities and differences between the two, while then taking a look at the ethical consideration and actions of bride kidnapping, and then followed by a summary and conclusion. So, to begin, let's talk about the demographics of bride kidnapping. The term bride kidnapping can be used to describe the practice of a man or a group of men kidnapping a woman and forcing her into marriage. Normally, it is practiced by a man and his friend kidnapping a woman and physically or coercing her into marriage. They would kidnap her either by force or by means of deception to get her into the car with them. While it does differ from country to country the specifics of these kidnapping events, the overall idea is that the woman gets kidnapped and quote-unquote has a choice on whether or not to marry her kidnapper. Bride kidnapping still happens all over the world, but is most notoriously known to occur in Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, and several different parts of Africa. So, the progression of bride kidnapping over time, the first known time bride kidnapping was recorded dates all the way back to the Roman times, as a group of Roman men were searching for wives and they first tried to negotiate with the Sabine tribe. But after that was unsuccessful, the men decided to capture the Sabine women during a festival called the Neptune Equester. One of the most infamous cases of bride kidnapping was the kidnapping of Helen of Troy, as it was believed that the Trojan War started because of this. So some cultural aspects that attribute to bride kidnapping. So just a little bit of an overview, because I'll be going more into depth about this when I'm looking at specific countries and everything. So one major cultural factor that plays into bride kidnapping is a patriarchal culture. As traditional gender roles play a huge part in the male dominance of society, this leads to forced marriage becoming unfortunately normalized in these different types of society. A lot of these places also do not recognize forced marriages as a crime, and most of the women who experience this don't get the justice that they deserve. They see it as part of a tradition and not something that is physically and mentally harmful to women. This dynamic also leads to skewed gender roles within the community, as the male is looked at to be more of the superior gender while women are frequently mistreated. Another huge aspect of this is the economic hardship of families in the communities, as arranged marriages can be quite costly because of huge dowries that can be placed and set that most families cannot afford it. They see forced marriage and bride kidnapping as a way to avoid these financial burdens, and also as a way to combine different finances between the families. So, bride kidnapping has a huge impact on women mentally, physically, and also the societal effects it has. Women suffer severe mental and physical challenges from bride kidnapping, as it is a pretty violent crime that happens to them. The abduction process most of the time involves physical abuse, with most women getting raped or sexually assaulted by their kidnapper. The physical abuse does not only stop there, as throughout this quote unquote marriage, most women experience some type of domestic abuse / violence. This also has a huge negative impact on their mental well being, as it is a traumatic thing to experience and go through, and then especially having to live with their kidnapper and forced to live and spend the rest of their life with their abusers. Many kidnapped brides suffer from depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Socially, bride kidnapping reinforces the inequality in gender norms and supports a patriarchal society. Women who attempt to leave these forced marriages experience some sort of social shame, as returning home from a marriage is seen as dishonorable and is frowned upon. In most countries, there is some sort of law that deems forced marriage and bride kidnapping to be illegal. It's often classified under general kidnapping laws, and penalty and punishment follows the same. Yeah, however, in some countries, while there is legal action, rarely anything gets done about it, and most of the time, women do not get the justice that they deserve. So let's take a look at bride kidnapping in two specific countries, Kyrgyzstan and China. Kyrgyzstan is set in the Middle East and Asia and has a population of 6.5 million people with a ratio of 112 females to 113 males. Around 90% of the people are Muslim, with a few select different religious communities like Christianity and Judaism. The vast majority of people live in the rural areas, which is very important to take note of because bride kidnapping mainly happens in these rural areas, with more than 50% of the population living in the two main cities, Bishkek and Osh. This only accounts for around 12% of the country's area. So that was just a quick overview of Kyrgyzstan, the demographics, the region, and everything. So let's take a look at the history of bride kidnapping in this country. So it is still a little bit unknown, but it's believed to stem from the nomadic customs of the Kyrgyz tribes, and it is called alukachu, which translates to grab and run. It was sometimes practiced as a method of elopement for couples whose family did not approve of their marriage. However, it quickly took a dark turn and became what it is today, which involves the abduction of a young woman and coercing her into marriage, most of the time using physical force to convince her to marry the groom. The woman is first kidnapped by him. So, bride kidnapping, I was able to find a report of how bride kidnapping is done in this country, and it's first done by a woman getting kidnapped by a man, either by deception or being forcefully taken. She is then led into his home or the home of one of his close relatives, and there she most of the time is immediately raped. The woman is then presented with a marriage scarf by a family member of the groom and is either physically or psychologically coerced into accepting the marriage proposal. If the marriage scarf is placed over her head, that means she accepts the marriage proposal and is then asked to write a letter of consent to her family informing them of the marriage. The last event that occurs is when the groom's relatives send the woman's family an apology and bring the letter of consent with them. Most of the time, it seems like this woman is presented with a choice by not accepting the marriage scarf or not. However, in reality, they rarely ever get a choice. The woman is normally being broken down mentally, physically hurt until they accept this proposal. So another specific instance is that, it is legal. However, around 20% of marriages in this country result from bride kidnapping, with the rate being significantly higher in rural areas. Many victims end up staying in the marriage and are really left with no choice because rejecting a kidnapping is often culturally unacceptable for women and perceived as a rejection of the Kyrgyz cultural identity. In fact, many citizens who are a part of the older generation believe that it's a harmless tradition. As one 6-year-old woman states, "I was married that way and I'm happy with my family. My husband never beat me and everything turned out well." While people younger than 50 are more likely to quote-unquote reject the tradition of bride kidnapping because to them it is a thing of the past and does not align with their beliefs. However, there are also some instances of women who will still follow this tradition and agree to being kidnapped before marriage to uphold the tradition as they see it as a romantic gesture. One unfortunate case was in 2018 when a 19-year-old woman, Brule Turdalivia, was abducted and forced into marriage by a 30-year-old man. Once she was found, her and her kidnapper was taken to the police station. There, the police left her alone with her kidnapper and she was brutally stabbed and murdered by him. He then tried to stab himself, but unfortunately, he survived. He faced 20 years in a high-security penal colony with confiscation of property. This caused a huge public discourse, with many of her close relatives blaming the police for her murder, and it is also a case of bride kidnapping turning violent very quickly. So, legal actions in this country of when it comes to bride kidnapping. So, bride kidnapping is a major issue in this community, and it happens way too often. It is illegal in Kyrgyzstan, and it says forcing a woman to marry or to continue a marriage or kidnapping her in order to marry her without her consent will be punished under the law. The prescribed penalty is a fine of the amount of 100 to 200 times the monthly wage or up to 5 years in prison. However, prosecutions for this crime never really happens, as it's a rare occurrence. Most victims of bride napping don't receive the justice that they deserve, as some experts have said that they have not seen a single case even go to trial. This may be because a lot of victims very rarely turn to the police, as the psychological pressure, fear of social stigma, and fear of retaliation prevent a woman from fleeing a man's home after she is abducted, and also dissuade her from reporting this crime of kidnapping to the authorities. Even in the rare instance when a woman can overcome these barriers and file a complaint, a lot of the authorities fail to prosecute cases of abduction. They'll get told that it's tradition and everyone does it. Some researchers saying that out of 186 women who were interviewed about kidnapping, only 3 had brought criminal cases, and in those 3 cases, she said the men were not punished. Now let's take a look at China. It has a population of 1.4 billion people with a ratio of 1 female to every 2 males. The population practices a mix of different religions, with about folk religion being the most at around 22%, followed by Buddhism and Christianity. Most of the population can be found on the eastern half of the country, as the western side is filled with mountainous terrain, and although it's ranked first in the world in total population, overall density is less than that of many other countries in Asia and Europe. So, a little bit of the history about bride kidnapping in China. This is where it differs from Kyrgyzstan, because Kyrgyzstan was kind of seen as more a tradition, as bride kidnapping in China is a negative effect of the decade-long one-child policy. It left a major gender imbalance, with the ratio of men to women being 2 to 1. And today there are around 34 million more men in the country than women, a figure that means that for millions of men, marriage, especially to a lot of local Chinese women, is nearly impossible. There was some leniencies for this law in other rural areas of China, where families were allowed to have more than one child if their firstborn was a girl. This left a huge impact on the ratio of men to women in the country. Another major factor is quote-unquote bride price. Women in China had to get married, and a bride price is exactly what it sounds like, an amount of money men needed to pay to get married. It's a form of dowry, and nationwide it was only going up. In a rural area like Qingyang, where there were a lot more men than women, the bride price can be as high as 150,000 won, or about $22,000 in USD. With the fact of how expensive marriage is and the complete gender imbalance of the country, it made China a hotspot for human trafficking and bride kidnapping. In between the years 2011 and 2017, there were around 6,000 reported cases of bride kidnapping, though that number is believed to be a lot higher. A lot of these reported instances were in Vietnam, but it is believed that these women were kidnapped and then trafficked within China. So a specific instance of this is one high-profile instance is the case of Chao Kuami, who was found shackled in a hut in Feng County in January of 2022. A video of her was circling on a famous website called Weibo, and many users were suspecting that she was a victim of human trafficking. However, local authorities in Feng County initially dismissed these claims, asserting that the woman who identified as Yang had a mental disorder and was not a trafficking victim. However, investigations revealed that she had been sold multiple times since the 1990s from her hometown, Yuan, before ultimately being purchased by the Dong family for marriage. The case shed light on the deeper issue of bride trafficking in China, reigniting discussions about the exploitation of women and the systematic issues that enable such practices. It has been reported that she had been sold at least 3 separate times during the 90s before being sold on to her quote-unquote husband. Her case gained a ton of media attention, and with that, a lot more media coverage of the ongoing bride kidnapping problem that happens in China. So some legal actions of what the country is deciding to do about it. It does have a law to prohibit forced marriage and sex trafficking. However, it's still a huge problem that happens in the country, as there's been many instances that have been reported of women being deceived into marriage by being promised different employment opportunities. These women were most likely trafficked from other countries such as Myanmar, Cambodia, and Pakistan. The enforcement of the law has been weak, especially in cases that involved women being trafficked from other countries. Unfortunately, some of the victims who did go and seek help often got in prison for quote-unquote breaking immigration laws instead of being treated like a victim of a crime. China's worked with some of the neighboring countries to come to an agreement to investigate some missing women cases, and organizations such as Human Rights Watch and the Pacific Links Foundations have urged China to improve victim support services, enforce anti-trafficking laws, and create legal pathways for migrant workers to prevent trafficking. Now, after taking a look into both countries, let's take a look and compare and contrast the two countries and look at the similarities and differences in each. So, how bride kidnapping is perceived is where these countries differ a lot, as in Kyrgyzstan, bride kidnapping or alakachu is often viewed through a cultural lens, with some considering it a long-standing tradition, while others recognize it as a serious violation of human rights. And despite it being completely illegal, it remains very prevalent in society, particularly in rural areas, where many people support the practice. A lot of women, they feel pressure to accept this marriage due to social stigma, and law enforcement rarely intervenes. A lot of experts have said that, especially about the punishment for the crime, that one activist, Zahana Sarlavia, said that it's crazy that there's only a 20,000 sum fine for abduction. He takes her, rapes her, and throws her out and just gets a fine. And a lot of other researchers and activists are really upset about how normalized bride kidnapping is in Kyrgyzstan. While in China, bride kidnapping is not considered a cultural tradition, but it is linked to the gender imbalance that the country has, which was a negative correlation when it regards to the one child policy. Women, particularly from rural areas or neighboring countries like Vietnam and Myanmar, are often abducted and sold into forced marriages. They're tricked into thinking that they would receive some employment opportunities, but then they would just get human trafficked and sold and impregnated by multiple different men. The practice is widely condemned, yet enforcement remains inconsistent due to the corruption and weak protection of women in the country. And public outcry, such as the case that I talked about, Xiao Humei, has pressured the government to take stronger legal actions. So now looking into the cultural factors, like I said, alikachu is historical in the country, and that is why a lot of people relate bride kidnapping to some sort of tradition or romantic gesture. But even today, it's become more coercive. Gender roles in the Kyrgyz society place a significant pressure on women to marry and bear children, and a lot of the time, refusing a marriage, even after being kidnapped, can bring a lot of shame to a woman's family, and even like blacklist them out of society because of that. And a lot of the time, many believe that once a woman was abducted, she is quote unquote ruined for other suitors and already taken care of. It perpetuates a system where women are treated as commodities rather than individuals with rights. And once these women are abducted, they face immense pressure to stay with their kidnappers. And the lack of legal enforcement further marginalizes women and reinforces the idea that their autonomy is secondary to their cultural traditions. This is a little bit similar to how it is in China, as it's largely driven by the country's gender imbalance, which was, like I said, um, because the country did have a cultural preference for male heirs, and the shortage of women have led to an underground market for trafficked brides, often from poor regions or other countries. Additionally, the traditional views on marriage pressure women to marry, even in unfavorable conditions, so these women can then take care of the home and bear children for their extended family. Um, this highlights the broader issue of gender discrimination within the country, and women, especially from rural or foreign backgrounds, are often viewed as properties, and a lot of the victims face difficulty escaping because of social isolation as they are brought to a country where they don't know the language, um, threats of violence, and a lot of challenges within the government when they go and try to seek legal assistance. So this kind of leads to also how women are perceived in society, because I feel like this is one of the major factors, and it's very similar in both societies. So in Kyrgyzstan, women are often expected to prioritize marriage and family over personal aspirations, and even in cases of forced marriage, the burden of maintaining the household falls onto them. Like, while in urban areas there has been some progress being made towards gender imbalance a lot of the times, but in rural communities there has been little to no progress. Women are considered the property of their male family members, with young women and girls at the risk of bride kidnapping or being burdened with like a lot of the household chores that they have. This is very similar in China, as China has made significant strides to gender equality, but like in Kyrgyzstan, rural areas don't see as much progress. Women who resist arranged or forced marriages may face her family's pressure or economic disadvantages, and particularly if they come from marginalized communities. And um, a national represented survey in 1999 to 2000 found that 34% of women aged 20 to 64 with a spouse or a partner experienced domestic violence, and the proportion was substantially more in rural areas. So, a lot of the time, the women are getting abused and are living very unhappy marriages at the cost of not being shunned out by society. So, ethical consideration and action. Um, So, bride kidnapping is a grave violation of women's rights in both China and Kyrgyzstan, and by subjecting them, both women, into forced marriages. So, at its core, bride kidnapping it's stripping a woman of her own consent, and by forcibly abducting her and forcing her into marriage, denies her the right to freely choose a partner. And this lack of consent is a direct violation of basic human rights and undermines the principle of individual self-determination. And a lot of the time, they often endure physical violence, which includes beatings and rapes, and severely compromises their bodily integrity. The act of treating a woman as an object or commodity, like something that can be traded or controlled or sold, devalues her dignity and reinforces a societal view that women are less than men. And just like the overall experience of being kidnapped and forced into a marriage can lead to long-term psychological harm, including post-traumatic stress disorder, like I said, depression, and anxiety. And the social stigma attached to forced marriages often isolate survivors, denying them access to support and hindering their ability to rebuild their own lives, because a lot of the time people, like especially in Kyrgyzstan, a woman who has already been kidnapped is already spoken for. And bride kidnapping is justified on cultural grounds. It perpetuates patriarchal norms that positions women as properties. This normalization of violence against women not only condones abuse, but also creates a vicious cycle where subsequent generations internalize and replicate these discriminatory practices. So those are some ethical issues. Now taking a look at different global issues, especially in like China, for instance, and different Central Asia and Southeast Asia, bride kidnapping often overlaps with human trafficking networks. But in countries such as Kyrgyzstan, it's estimated that a significant proportion of marriages results from these forced abductions. Despite international conventions like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, many countries struggle with weak enforcement of anti-kidnapping laws. In Kyrgyzstan, for instance, although legal reforms have increased penalties, the implementation remains inconsistent, often due to local cultural acceptance and the influence of the law. Some economic factors also play a huge role in it, as in some areas the financial burden of a traditional marriage custom like a dowry or bride price in China can push families to agree to or even facilitate bride kidnapping as a means to reduce economic strain. This exploitation of economic vulnerability not only harms women but also reinforces broader cycles of poverty and gender-based discrimination. And it has a huge impact on the social development of women as it affects her education and employment opportunities and can limit their participation in public life. So global and local response. Organizations like the UN Women, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women have consistently highlighted bride kidnapping as a human rights violation, and these groups work to document the cases. The countries try to take steps forward to toughen legal penalties for bride kidnapping. In 2013, Kyrgyzstan increased the maximum prison term for forced marriage from 3 to 10 years. Local NGOs and community organizations play a huge role in raising awareness and providing support for different survivors. And global media attention and social media campaigns have brought cases like those of Xiaomi in China to international notice. These campaigns help mobilize the public opinion and can pressure government to act more decisively against the practice. So a summary and conclusion. Bride kidnapping is a serious violation of human rights that perpetuates gender inequality and undermines of women's rights. While cultural traditions and the economic hardships often allow the practice to keep its traditional roots, growing awareness and legal reforms have made progress in working on it. However, more needs to be done to ensure that the laws are enforced and people are being held accountable and that survivors receive the support that they need. Bride kidnapping is a practice in which a woman is abducted and forced into marriage without her consent. It occurs in various different countries, included but not limited to Kyrgyzstan, China, Ethiopia, and different parts of Southeast Asia. In some cases, it's considered a cultural tradition, while in a lot of other cases, it's linked to human trafficking. Cultural and economic factors contribute to the persistence of bride kidnapping in societies with strong patriarchal norms. Forced marriage is sometimes justified as a way to preserve family honor or avoid high bride prices. Additionally, in regions where women are scarce due to gender imbalance, bride kidnapping is sometimes used to secure wives. Efforts to combat bride kidnapping include legal reforms, educational programs, and advocacy by local and international organizations. Countries like Kyrgyzstan have strengthened penalties against bride kidnapping. Meanwhile, global organizations like the UN Women and Human Rights Watch continue to push for stronger protection for women and greater awareness of this issue. These are my references. And thank you for watching.